At the second trial, Prosecutor Murphy appeared again for the government. He did much better than the first time. He tried the case before, he knew all the pitfalls. No more, if you don't believe Chambers, we have no case. In the second trial, I think he had a new strategy. He said, I need one witness plus corroboration. The first trial, I said, my star witness is Chambers, corroborated by the documents. In the second trial, his basic approach was, my star witness is the documents, corroborated by Chambers. Chambers changed his story. The documents don't change their story. They are the immutable witnesses, he told the jury. Hiss, for his part, made a major and I think fatal change in strategy. He fired Lloyd Paul Stryker, and he abandoned Stryker's strategy of trying to produce endless hung juries. I suspect Hiss was out of money and was running out of energy. I also think a lot of his A-list lawyers may have been running out of unbillable time they could give to his defense, or maybe they were getting paid, I don't know. They may have begun thinking he was guilty too, as some of them did. He wanted his second trial to be his last, and he was also, it's not hard to believe this, put off by Stryker's sort of florid histrionic style. And Hiss thought that based on his summer residence in Vermont, he could get the second trial moved there. The grounds for this move being saying that all the newspaper, the media coverage of the first trial made getting an impartial jury impossible in New York City. He was told, Vermont juries reach verdicts. They don't hang. You will get a verdict from a Vermont jury. But his motion for a change of venue, as we say, to Vermont was denied, so the second trial was held in Manhattan, as was the first. But in anticipation of the second trial being held in Vermont, before the motion was denied, Hiss fired Lloyd Paul Stryker, and I imagine Vermont juries in 1949 being composed of granite-faced maple syrup farmers, Yankee types, and he thought that Stryker's cartwheels and handstands would put them off. So he hired instead a very distinguished Boston trial lawyer named Claude Cross. His firm was named Withington, Cross, Park, and McCann. Like Ed McLean, Cross was a former law school classmate of Hiss's. I've heard him described as a wry and diffident transplanted Southerner who was used to trying complex corporate cases. He was industrious and thorough. Where Stryker shouted, Cross tried to persuade. According to some people, this was his first criminal trial. The basic strategy of the Hiss defense at the second trial was sort of the same as the first. Blacken Chambers' name, emphasize Hiss's sterling character, but Cross, perhaps inspired by Hiss's legalistic mind, emphasized the particular rather than Stryker's high-level contrast of the two men. If Stryker was the sky above, Cross was the mud below. Some more metaphors. In my opinion, there were lots of notes to the Hiss defense in the second trial, but there was no music the way there was to Stryker's defense in the first trial. For example, here is a question that Claude Cross asked Whittaker Chambers when he was on the witness stand. On or about October 19, 1949, did it come to your attention that counsel for the defendant had inquired from the Passport Division of the United States of the Department of State whether or not an application had ever been issued under the name of J. Vivian Chambers, J. David Whittaker Chambers, David Chambers, David Whittaker Chambers, Whittaker Chambers, Charles Whittaker, Charles Adams, Arthur Dwyer, David Breen, Lloyd Cantwell, or Carl Carlson? I'm glad nobody ever asked me that question. Cross tried to prove in 100 little ways that Chambers' story was factually implausible. He also tried to prove, more than Lloyd Stryker, that the man who gave Chambers the documents was Julian Wadleigh and a third person, Mr. X. Perhaps Cross's greatest disadvantage was that he was trying the case for the first time, whereas Murphy knew the case cold. And the second time around, he was much, much better. There was also a new judge at the second trial. Judge Kaufman had come under scathing public criticism from Nixon and others for favoring Hiss. Not a fair rap, in my opinion. The judge at the second trial was Henry Goddard. He was the oldest judge in the district, an appointee of President Harding. If you look at a photograph of him, he looks like a bald eagle, very stern, not visibly overflowing with the milk of human kindness. Judge Goddard let in a lot more evidence than Kaufman did at the first trial, and he was liberal for both sides, and this made the second trial a lot longer than the first trial was. Now, a few Hiss supporters have said that he napped, that he dozed off during the trials. I think he was about 70. No dispassionate people at the trial said so, and I see no sign of that in the trial record. He intervened in the questions and answers frequently. The second jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, all white like the first jury. There were 7 housewives, a company treasurer, a lawyer's mortgage expert, an optician, an electrical company manager, and a retired manufacturer of plastics. And the second trial was 80% a rehash of the first. As at the first one, neither Hiss nor Chambers nor either of their wives cracked or made a big mistake on the witness stand. Chambers was much more communicative at the second trial, perhaps less intimidated the second time around, and Claude Cross was a lot less intimidating than Lloyd Paul Stryker. And Judge Goddard let Chambers and every other witness tell her story, the whole story, all he wanted to say, a lot more than Judge Kaufman had. And I'm going to concentrate on a few key differences between the first and second trials. There were 3 major witnesses who testified at the second trial, but not at the first, and one was for the prosecution. A petite, middle-aged woman took the stand and testified, I imagine, with a thick Central European accent. And she said roughly as follows. My name is Hede Massing. I was born in 1900 in Vienna, back when that was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and there I became an actress and an anti-fascist. I've been married 3 times and divorced twice. That's quite a shocker for those days, but you know, these are showbiz people. My first 2 husbands were communists. I was sympathetic to communism, but I never became a formal card-carrying member of the party. It was better if I could do anti-fascist work in cooperation with the communists, but without any formal ties to the party where my name would be on membership lists or something. So I did anti-fascist work from outside the communist movement, starting in Vienna in 1919. My first husband was Gerhard Eisler, who was a major operator of secret communist organizations in the United States and elsewhere. He recently he fled the U.S. and skipped over the Iron Curtain to East Germany. My second husband owned a book publishing company. I've been married to my third husband, Paul Massing, for 18 years now. My husband Paul and I were in Germany when Hitler came to power, and my husband was put into one of his first concentration camps. He got out, came to the United States in 1934, and wrote a book about his horrible experience. I'd come to the United States in early 1933 and began doing secret work for the communists. As before, in my own mind, my main purpose was to fight fascism. By the way, in 1937, I and my husband became disillusioned with what was going on in the Soviet Union, and we ended all of our dealings with that country and the Communist Party. But back in 1934, when I was a dedicated worker, acting in concert with the communist underground in the United States, I was moved to Washington and was charged with finding people in the government who would be willing to pass information to the Soviet Union. All, of course, with the goal of helping to fight Hitler and defend progressive mankind. A man named Noel Field, a longtime employee of the State Department, had been impressed by my husband's book. And oddly enough, he got in touch with me. And I got to know him very well, and this is how I was supposed to romance my possible sources. Once after we both had dinner and he had become drunk, we walked around the monuments in downtown Washington, and at the Lincoln Memorial, Mr. Field waved his hands in the air as he sang the Communist Party anthem, the Internationale, to the statue of Abraham Lincoln. Well, one night I finally popped the question to Noel, would he pass me paper for the State Department that I would pass on to the Soviet Union? And he replied that, oh, you're giving me a great conflict of loyalties. First, I have great sympathy for communism, but I don't want to betray my country, and that's what you're asking me to do. And my second conflict of loyalties is that somebody else is trying to recruit me into his Soviet spy ring. And I was offended that someone was sort of poaching on my territory, as it were, stealing someone I'd spent a lot of time recruiting. And I said, who is this person who's my competitor? And he said, well, it's a friend of mine, a very wonderful man, a man of high ethics and moral standards, an educated Marxian. I said, I want to meet this man. And Mr. Field said, come to my house for dinner in a couple of nights, like next Tuesday or something. And, well, the appointed night came. This was in the late summer or early fall of '35, Mrs. Massing said. I arrived at the Field's place. Mr. and Mrs. Field were there. And then in walked Alger Hiss. And we had a few cocktails and got a bit tipsy, and then at some point, Mr. Hiss and I had a little tete-a-tete all by ourselves, and I don't recall exactly who said what to whom after all those years and a couple of drinks, but the gist of the conversation was as follows. I said, so I understand you're trying to get Noel Field out of my organization and into yours. And Mr. Hiss replied, and you're the famous girl who's trying to get Noel away from me. And I said, yes. And he said, well, we'll see who's going to win. And I said, well, you realize you're competing with a woman. And then either I or Mr. Hiss said, well, whoever wins Noel, we're all working for the same boss. Alger Hiss denied Massing's story completely. He said, I've never been to Noel Field's house. It's total fantasy. Noel Field denied everything too, but not in court. His indignant denial came from communist Czechoslovakia, whither he had skipped when the HUAC hearings began. I think he spent the rest of his life on that side of the Iron Curtain. Now, after direct examination comes cross-examination. Massing was perhaps weakened a little on cross when she admitted two things. One was that she was going to write a book about her colorful life, which arguably gave her a financial motive to tell whopper stories or very exciting stories. Also, apparently she'd been at a party, a cocktail party, not long before her testimony, and she had been recounting this conversation she said she had with Hiss, and she faltered and turned to a journalist and said, what happened next? And the journalist replied, well, you ought to know. It happened to you. And she said that she had repeated the story so often recently that she was beginning to get confused. And that when she talked about at this party, she said nothing about the line about, well, we're all working for the same boss. Incidentally, Judge Kaufman did not allow her to testify at the first trial. And the reason was that, consistent with his very crimping attitude towards the scope of the case, he said, I want to minimize mention of communism. There's no mention of it in the indictment, and it's extremely prejudicial to call somebody a communist in these days. And remember that his reading of the indictment, it's a fair one. The first material act in this case takes place on January 2nd, 1937. And Massing is talking about something she said happened 18 months before. So yes, it shows Hiss in the communist underground, but it's got nothing to do with Chambers or passing documents to Chambers. It's too prejudicial, it's not very probative, it's too remote in time. Sorry, said Judge Kaufman, it does not pass my test for admissible evidence. Judge Goddard at the second trial obviously took another view. He thought that showing Hiss was in the Soviet underground made it relevant enough, and trying to minimize mentions of communism in this case is really closing the barn door after a whole herd of cows has gotten out. The next witness testified on a subject you may have wondered about. What would a psychiatrist say about the mental health of Whittaker Chambers?